Peter Mathews is a professor of political science and international relations at Cypress College, Long Beach, California, and he joins us now via Zoom. Thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being with you.
All right, so help us understand this debt ceiling. How is it that America, richest nation in the world, some would say, is in a situation where it's got trillions and trillions in debt, and they have to constantly get to this point of almost going over the cliff periodically? I think we've heard this song so many times. How do we keep getting here?
In fact, it's not only remarkable, it's astounding, isn't it? When you think about it, the richest country in the history of humankind, the biggest economy in the world, and they can't pay all their bills, or they keep raising the debt ceiling to borrow more money. Part of it has to do with the United States Constitution, which I think there's nothing wrong with borrowing, as long as the investment, the money is borrowed, is invested in growing the economy, in growing human capital, in growing the infrastructure that's human infrastructure and physical infrastructure. Then you can grow the economy as long as you're investing it. And if you're investing it, if you're borrowing the money to fight wars, like in Iraq, where President Bush borrowed over $1 trillion to fight the war in Iraq, and that ran up to a $3 or $4 trillion debt with interest, then it's not very productive. So it's how you borrow, and also you need to also spend money that you actually raise through taxes. You can't give big tax cuts as President Trump did a couple of years ago to the top 1%. 83% went to the top 1%, and that was $1.5 trillion in tax cuts, and still have a balanced budget. So both parties are to blame, but mostly it seems the Republicans have driven the debt up further for things that don't invest in America or grow the economy.
And my understanding is that these debates right now are not about future spending, but fulfilling obligations that have already been incurred. And those would then be Republican debts by and large. Why would they not vote then to get them paid?
It's so ironic, when the Republicans were in the majority in the House and Senate, Mitch McConnell, he was in charge there, and Democrats voted to raise the debt ceiling and to pay the debts and to pay the interest on the debt. The Democrats were willing to compromise with the Republicans when they were not in power in the majority and still get it done. The Republicans are intransigent in this case, and it's a real shame because it seems like the party has gone so far to the right side of the spectrum, they can't see beyond their nose in terms of understanding that a capitalist system requires supply and demand. You have to have demand for products, so people have to have money in their hands. So social spending, a certain amount, is very important. We have to upgrade our infrastructure, our electrical grid. We have to bring in so many things like electric cars that would take us off the fossil fuels and get new jobs created. That would be the kind of spending that we should be doing, that the Republicans are unwilling to do. And the President Biden's plan is right on the button when it comes to that kind of spending. And Democrats are trying to get that together so they can push that through, even without Republican support if need be. So it seems to me there's two different philosophies among the parties, and that's a big problem. And the majority of Americans seem to stand with most of the Democratic issues, such as tuition-free college, such as universal health care. Those things are supported by 70% of the American people. Yet the Republicans don't want to do it because of their base, this firm, strong right-wing base that keeps holding them back to some extent.
So what are the consequences if, for whatever reason, for the first time, the government actually does default on these payments?
It would be horrendous. I mean, not only would people not get paid their Social Security checks, but the U.S. government cannot even borrow further if it needs to keep the government operating. You could have cuts in social services, in firefighters, in police. You could have cuts certainly in ongoing expenses to keep the various lights on and businesses working in the government. A lot of those things, but mainly the United States credit will be completely shattered. The credit worthiness of the United States will be shattered because the U.S. has never defaulted on its debt. The U.S. Constitution allows the Congress to borrow on the United States credit, on its own credit, and it's allowed to borrow as much as it wants to spend or to pay its debts. And if the United States says we cannot do this, we will not borrow, we will not tax the super rich to bring the money in, or close the corporate loopholes to bring it in, we are going to be irresponsible. If the Republicans say that when they're holding back the government from doing the right thing, then the consequences are horrendous. They'll have an impact on the economies around the world, including the Chinese economy and other economies that interact with the U.S. on an ongoing basis. Economies in Europe and parts of Africa and other parts of the world that rely on the reliability of the American dollar, reliability of the Americans to pay their debts. That will be shattered. It will be very, very tragic.
Explain to us how this works in America, because here in South Africa, we'd expect the president just to sign an executive order, instruct his finance minister to get the job done. How did this end up in Congress, which is the equivalent of our parliament?
Yes, we have a system that's the separation of powers. We have three branches of government, co-equal, and they sometimes go at loggerheads with each other, and that's a problem when you're trying to get good policy passed, necessary critical policy passed. Sometimes one branch will not agree with the other. Sometimes within the one branch, within the Congress, one house won't agree with the other, or one party won't agree with the other, or even within the party. Today, within the Democratic Party, there's a conflict between that $3.5 trillion package that Biden wants and most Democrats want. A few moderate, so-called moderate Democrats, mostly corporate-sponsored, don't want to have the $3.5 trillion social investment in childcare, elder care, and all kinds of things that would help the human capital work. So there's divisions within the party, divisions between parties, and divisions among the various branches of government. You have a parliamentary system where the majority basically rules. If the majority of voters vote for one party over the other, or one coalition over the other, that coalition gets to push through its policies without any question. The prime minister leads the coalition. If the people don't like it, they have a vote of no confidence. People go out and protest, vote of no confidence, a new government is selected, or a new prime minister is. And there's a lot of checks from the people over the government. Over here, it's the loggerheads that the checks and balances sometimes doesn't work that well. Other times it does work well, where the Congress doesn't get along with the president, or within the Congress, there's disputes between parties. It's a real shame now there's such polarization, and Donald Trump has a lot of responsibility here. He has to take that responsibility, because last time he was in office, he really pushed the party to the far right, and it made people refuse vaccinations. We got a huge crisis right now for the lack of vaccination. Most of European countries have jumped way ahead of us because they don't have this anti-vaxxer group that Donald Trump capitalized on and stirred up to go against masking and vaccinating. And we only have 55% of our people vaccinated, totally fully vaccinated. That's a shame. Other countries have 65%, 70%, and we're not going to get to herd immunity. And this is a big problem, not just for politics, but for health and economics too. So that's the way the system works here. And until we get both parties in power to work together, the Democrats only have a one-vote majority. They barely have that. It's tied, actually, in the Senate. And the vice president cast a tie-breaking vote. That's not a big enough majority to push through the programs that the American people wanted when they put the Democrats in power. That's the main problem in our system right now.
So it sounds as if the Republicans are essentially taking a gamble, because there are midterm elections on the horizon. And if they find themselves being blamed for a default, surely that's going to have a negative impact on their electability.
Absolutely correct. The only thing they're hoping that the public will blame the Democrats, and that's why they want the Democrats to vote for the debt ceiling increase and then blame them for being irresponsible spenders. It's a big, bad game of bad politics that they're trying to push, to blame the Democrats rather than just working with them, as the Democrats have done when they were out of power. They worked with the Republicans, even with the Republican president. And these Republicans, led by Mitch McConnell, other extreme right-wingers, Josh Hawley, so many others, and Donald Trump himself, are incalcitrant. They're incalcitrant. They're recalcitrant. They will not seem to want to work things out and compromise. Look at what Donald Trump said. He was saying that the election was stolen, that he didn't lose it, that Joe Biden took it illegally, and he tried his best in the courts to fight that fight, which he lost. He still keeps on harping on that, and this is a problem for legitimacy. In democracy, we know, the Democratic Republic, when one side loses the election, they should actually accept that, and then be willing to let the other side have their shot at it, their chance of making the country great and working to make it good. But if one side says, we didn't lose, we actually won when they actually lost, that's a question of delegitimizing the actual system and the system of government. And that's a dangerous thing that I'm afraid to say that Donald Trump has had a big hand in that. And we're trying to overcome that right now by bringing people together. Biden is trying to do it. It's very difficult right now.
And it comes at the worst possible time, where social spending had to be bumped up because of COVID-19. And so this debt situation has arisen because of an emergency. And yet we've got politicians playing as if it's another day in the office.
There are many of them, and it's very unfortunate and despicable that they would do that when this country is crying out for solutions right now with COVID-19 that we've all been through in such a traumatic way, including the whole world and South Africa as well. It's just a horrendous situation. We should be pulling together, nations coming together. The global north countries like the United States should be helping other countries in the global south to have enough vaccines. And even our own people have to be vaccinated and should take the vaccine. People are begging for vaccines in other countries, and here we have an overglut of vaccines available, and 25% of the American population refuses to be vaccinated. That is about 80 million people, in addition to our children below 12 years old. That's 50 million more. About 130 million Americans have not been vaccinated. That's such a danger. It's a crisis. And you know, the Chinese language in Mandarin says the character of a crisis has two parts: danger and opportunity. And if you don't seize the opportunity by overcoming the danger and going forward in the right way, your country can lose. We can all lose, and then the world will lose eventually. And unfortunately, many of these leaders in politics don't see it that way. They want to get reelected. They want to address their base and their donors mostly. That's a big problem.
Is there an alternative to having a debt ceiling? I mean, there are very few countries in the world that I can think of that actually have this mechanism.
You're right. I don't think any country that I know of has that mechanism. There may be some exceptional nation we haven't really heard much of. But this is the exceptional country that's got that debt ceiling idea, because I think when Ronald Reagan was in office, he spent a lot of money without, on defense and military without raising taxes. He cut taxes and spent a lot of money on defense and drove the deficit up so high, and the debt was added to, that people got gun shy and they said, oh my God, we have debt. We shouldn't have debt. Individuals don't have debt. They balance their checkbooks. They're responsible when they go to work. They only spend what they have. This is it's a false parallel, because a nation is not like an individual. It's true, as an individual, you need to balance your budget. You cannot keep on borrowing and spending. You'll go broke and you'll be out on the street. A nation like ours, which has in the Constitution the right of the Congress to be able to tax and spend or borrow and spend on its own credit. It's in the Constitution. The right of Congress to spend as much as it needs to promote the general welfare, to promote the common good, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. These are very hallowed words in the Constitution that says that the government has a positive role to play to promote the common good. And it needs to spend, when it needs to spend money, it needs to take it from those who have an excess of money, like the super wealthy billionaires and millionaires, and the corporate loopholes. That's something else. You don't get me started on that. There's so many American-based corporations that are paying zero income tax and receiving subsidies from the federal government, and they have a negative tax burden. In my book, Dollar Democracy on Steroids, I got a page in chapter 2, a table that shows 60 corporations out of hundreds that paid zero income tax in 2018 while getting loopholes from the government legally and also getting subsidies. And that's negative tax burden for those making billions of dollars a year. They're paying a negative tax burden of 40% or 30% or 10%. And this is unconscionable. And American people don't know much about this. And if they did, there wouldn't be any problem balancing our budget or even borrowing wisely and not unwisely.
All right,
so I think this is a very big constitutional issue. Yep.
Perhaps a final question. How is it that America can keep on going? I understand that national debt is now at 28.4 trillion, but the GDP is only 20 trillion. The maths doesn't work there.
It doesn't, for an individual or a country, if you look at it. And the thing is, if they did increase the debt ceiling by a couple of trillion, and by the way, Joe Biden's plan, which the Democrats have passed in one house or the other, but Republicans are opposing, the 3.5 trillion is over 10 years. It's not 3.5 trillion per year. It's 3.5 trillion over 10 years. And during those 10 years, the total amount of GDP will be 267 trillion. You're talking about spending 3.5 trillion more today to bring in money for people who are child care workers, elder care workers, so women who are professional can go to work again and be productive. They need some quality child care. Those kinds of programs, electric cars, new technologies, that's what the Biden plan of 3.5 trillion is asking us to spend. And it's over 10 years. During those 10 years, the GDP is going to be 267 trillion. You're asking for 3.5 trillion out of that. It's not a whole big amount, but yes, eventually we have to start paying down on the debt. And I would suggest we do it by closing the unproductive, unfair corporate loopholes, taxing some of the billionaires a little bit more at the upper incomes and bring the money in, and cancel the Trump tax cuts, bring in another 1.5 trillion and pay down the debt. That would be a good thing to do, a balanced way of addressing our economic needs right now.
Professor Mathews, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed. Let's hope that some adults can come into the room and actually think about the people. Thank you so much for your time.
I'm with you on that too. Thank you so much. Take care.
All right, that's Professor Peter Mathews talking to us about the situation that America finds itself in. The debt ceiling. Essentially, the country can't borrow above a certain amount without going to get permission from Congress and the Senate, and then they say yes or no. But we have a problem where we've got Congress that's split between the Democrats and the Republicans. They're fighting each other, and they've made this political rather than actually dealing with the issues at hand, and that's paying for the obligations that the American government has already incurred. Complex, but actually quite simple to solve. Anyway, that's where we'll leave that for the time being. Stay with us. You're watching The Globe.